Hey, welcome back. In today's lecture, it's going to be the first of two on biconnectivity. They're both going to be a little bit shorter than normal, I expect. The idea of biconnectivity is going to be one we're performing on an undirected graph. So the assumption here will be that we're dealing with an undirected graph. And the other thing that we're going to be focusing on is depth first search. Now that we've taken a look at depth first search, we saw topological sort could be solved using a depth first search approach or sort of a modified breadth first search approach in a way. And now this is going to be just a sort of a depth first search based algorithm. So take this graph, and since I'll need to put up other slides later on, you'll probably want to draw this in your notes so you have it in front of you because it won't always be on the screen. C, A, B, D, and then we have F, E, H, G, and then I. So consider that graph. And what we're concerned about here is being able to have all the vertices connected to each other. When we say a graph is connected, it means that you are able to find a path from every vertex to every other vertex. And that's why if you have some vertex J floating off to the side here, which I'm going to scratch out in a minute because it won't be part of our example, then that graph's not connected because you can't get from J to anywhere else. But in this graph now, you can find a path from every vertex to every other vertex, and so it's a connected graph. And of course, or I shouldn't say of course, you may not know, but with directed graphs, it's a little bit different definition because you can have the issue of direction interfering with that as well. But we're not dealing with that now. We're just going to be dealing with undirected graphs. So for undirected graphs, there's either path between every two vertices or there isn't. Your graph's connected or it's not. And this graph is connected. What we're wanting to find out is whether the graph is biconnected. And what we're talking about when we talk about biconnection is trying to find non-overlapping paths. For example, go from F to G to H, and imagine this graph could perhaps even be a series of routers on a network where they're forwarding email, where F sends an email and it gets sent to the G router, which routes it to H, and then whoever's at machine H gets the email. So there could be a path of machines that the mail gets sent along, or whatever other example you want to come up with this graph. But the point is that you have F to G to H is one path from F to H. Now if you go from F to E to H, that's another path. And those don't overlap except at the endpoints. Now they have to overlap at the endpoints because we're talking about going from a particular vertex X to a particular vertex Y. And so if we're saying, well, what are the paths from X to Y? Well, of course, X and Y will be in all those paths. But what we'd like is to have at least two paths that go from X to Y that don't overlap. There's no common vertices. And if you consider the path from F to D to E to H, well, that overlaps the F to E to H path at vertex E. So you have the F to E, or F to D to E to H path, and that's the same as the F, or it has some of the same vertices, particular vertex E and the edge EH. It has those same, that same vertex and that same edge. So even though we have those two paths, that's not what we're worried about. We're worried about the one or the other of those paths, and then this other path here that goes from F to G to H. And there I have two paths that don't intersect at all. They don't have a common edge. They don't even have a common vertex. And so I have two non-overlapping paths from F to H. On the other hand, consider going from A to G. I can have a number of ways to get from A to D. I can go A, C, D. I can go A to D directly. I can say A to B to D. Likewise, there's a number of ways to go from D to G. D, F, G, D, E, H, G, and so on. D, E, F, G. And so I have a huge variety of ways to get from A to G. I can say A, C, D, D, E, F, G, A, B, D, D, F, G. So I mean, I can just basically say, well, combine all the ways I can get to D and all the ways I can get to G from there, and if you combine one of the A to D paths with one of the D to G paths, you have a large number of paths that can go from A to G. But every single one of them uses D. And in fact, there are no paths in this graph that will take you from A to G without going through D. So I don't have two overlapping paths, or two non-overlapping paths from A to G. Every path from A to G is going to overlap at vertex D. And what that means for our purposes is that if you were to remove G and have a graph with D, or remove D rather, and have a graph with D not there, that looks like this, then that's going to disconnect the graph. And a real-world example could be, if your entire network depends on D, a router at D, and then the router goes down, well, then you can't send mail from A to G. You could still send mail around these machines, and you could send mail around those, but you couldn't send mail from A to G because the important network hub has crashed. So when we talk about a graph being biconnected, what we're saying is that pick any two vertices you want, and you'll be able to find two paths that go from one vertex to the other that don't overlap. There's two non-overlapping paths between every pair of vertices. And in this graph, we have some pairs of vertices, like F and H, will have two non-overlapping paths. But A and G, AH, BF, I and anything, those pairs don't have two non-overlapping paths. With I, if you were to remove the vertex G, that would disconnect I from everything else. And so in the sense that you can sort of think of it, one way to view it is as fault tolerance. You can think of it as if you imagine, like I said, the network example, and imagine one of these network routers goes down or something like that. And then you say, well, can the rest of the graph still function? And that's sort of a real-world example of this general idea, which is if we remove a vertex and all of its adjacent edges, is the graph still connected? And we don't have that with D. If you remove that, then this half of the graph can't communicate with that half any longer. So whereas if I had removed A, I would have had no trouble having everything else talk to each other. If I removed E, everything else could have the rest of the graph was still connected. So we say a graph is biconnected if you can remove any one vertex and the whole rest of the graph is still connected. And the reason it would still be connected is because even if there was a path that used that vertex you removed, there would also be a path that didn't. If I remove E, F can still talk to H because I had a path to H that did not involve E. But if I remove D, as I did down here, then A can't talk to G because there was no path from A to G that didn't involve D. I didn't have an alternative that didn't involve what I removed. And so if you have two non-overlapping paths, if you remove one vertex, well, even if that vertex was on one of your non-overlapping paths, there'll be the second non-overlapping path that doesn't involve that vertex because it doesn't overlap. And that's what we had here. FGH, FEH, those paths don't involve each other. So if I remove E, well, I had some path that didn't involve E. If I had removed G instead, I had some path that didn't involve G. And that's the problem with the A and G vertices, is every path involves D if you're traveling from A to G. And so in that case, if I remove D, then we're stuck. We have a disconnected graph because there was no alternative path that didn't involve D. If, on the other hand, there had been, if I had had this edge here, then I would have been okay with respect to D. I could have said, well, then that edge would have existed here. And everything would have been, at least, we still have trouble with G and I there. But as far as this area of the graph, now I would have had connection that didn't involve D. I could have said A, B, E, F, G, and basically connected this half to that half of the graph through this other edge. And so at that point, then the removal of D would be okay. And so I can remove D and not disconnect the graph. But that's if I have the edge BE, which I don't. That's why I drew it as a dotted line. So that's the idea of biconnectivity and why we would care. What we're trying to do is to say we want to have every pair of vertices be connected by at least two non-overlapping paths. What we're saying when we say that is we don't have any of these vertices that could disconnect the graph when they were moved. And I'm going to write the definition of this on the next slide, but these are known as cut vertices or articulation points, and I'll write that down in a moment. So what we're really saying is a graph that has a cut vertex is not biconnected. Because if it has a cut vertex, if you have a vertex that can disconnect the graph if you remove it, then that means that the graph isn't biconnected. A biconnected graph would be connected all the time, no matter which one vertex you removed. And so when we want to find out if a graph is connected, we're worried about these vertices that are called, we have here a cut vertex or articulation point are the two terms. And we say a vertex which, or I say a vertex whose removal results in a graph that is not connected. So if you have a connected graph and you remove this vertex and the graph's not connected anymore, then this was a cut vertex or articulation point. This was a vertex that had to be there because if it's not there, the graph breaks into two pieces. And if we say a graph is biconnected, that's the equivalent of saying there are no articulation points. No cut vertices. And so the idea then is if there are indeed two non-overlapping paths between every vertex, then we know there's no articulation points because it means that any one vertex we might remove, there'll be an alternative path between any two vertices not involving that vertex. On the other hand, if we do have any articulation points, then we'll have something like D where all the paths between a certain pair of vertices go through that vertex. And so in that case, removing that vertex would disconnect the graph. That means there was not an alternative path, and that means the graph wouldn't have been biconnected. So that's why that's the case. So in terms of discovering whether a graph is biconnected, so we might want to say, okay, is our current network layout going to be sufficient, or do we need to add some more cables or something like that? What we can do is to say that let's go ahead and try and find the articulation points in the graph. And if we don't find any, then we know the graph is biconnected, and otherwise we know it's not biconnected. And if we want to kind of approach being able to do this, what we can think of, one way we can approach this is to say, let's do a search in the graph. And we're going to want to use a depth first and not a breadth first search, and I'll explain why. Let's say we start at D, which we know from our discussion now is going to be a cut vertex or an articulation point. But let's consider if we started searching from D, if I do a breadth first search, I say I've got C, B, A, F, and E as neighbors. And the breadth first search would start at a starting vertex of our choosing and then proceed to examine all the neighbors at once. Where a depth first search would choose to only examine one neighbor. So we'd say, okay, pick D, you pick A, and then you start proceeding to examine the graph from A. And so in that case then, the question is, well, why is that helpful? If we say, let's do a complete search, a depth first search now off of A, and then return, what information will that give us that a breadth first search here doesn't give us? And to answer that question, we could go ahead and finish off the discussion here. I can say, well, from F, I can reach G, and from E, I can reach H, and then from G, I can reach I. So a breadth first search on the graph might look something like that. And we don't really have any sort of information about connections there. It's, we found out, how far everything is from D, but in terms of wondering about what can reach other vertices and not involve D, we don't have any information there. Where here, I can say, if I'm going to explore deeply from A. If I'm not going to return from A back to D until I've explored everything I can possibly reach from A, then that tells me, if I go here to B, there were no unmarked neighbors from B, I return, and there were no unmarked neighbors from C, so I return. Once I return then from A to D, and I have to start a second subtree, that tells me that there is no way that we can reach one half the graph from the other half without going through D. So if I finish off this depth first search spanning tree here, I say I have E, I go to F, I go to G, I go to I come back, I go to H. So that's one way to have proceeded with this. From E, I picked one child, and that went to F on that previous graph. And from F, I picked one child, and that was G. And then from G, I picked one child, and that was I. Had no neighbors there. I backed up to G. I further explored to H. And H has another neighbor, which is E, but that's already been marked. So I back up to G. G had no other neighbors, so I back up to F. And F had another neighbor, D, which has already been marked, so I can't go there, and I back up to E, and I back up to D, and I'm done. So that's the depth first search spanning tree on this graph. And I know if it's undirected and if it's connected to begin with, then I'll have just the one tree. If I start getting a depth first spanning forest, then what's going to happen, that means the graph wasn't connected to begin with. And if it wasn't connected, then certainly it wasn't biconnected. So, but the issue here is, if I explore vertex A and everything I can reach from it thoroughly, if when I come back to D, there are still vertices to look at, that means I couldn't have reached them from here. But if I had any sort of edge that connected any of these to any of those, I would have found that edge. I'm exploring all the neighbors of A, all the neighbors of B, and all the neighbors of C then. From A, I explore all the neighbors of B. When I finish, I go back to A and explore all the neighbors of C, and then I look at all its neighbors. If I had any chance at all to connect any of these to any of these, any of A, B, and C to any of E, F, G, H, and I, then I wouldn't have needed a second child of D. I would have reached some of these from here and would have proceeded to finish off the search. We can see that if I'm going to redraw this, and then I'm going to start a new depth first search from E. So if we start from D, a possible spanning tree we get looks like this. And this is exactly what I drew on the previous slide. If, on the other hand, I started E, then I can say, well, let's go ahead and go to F first. And then I could go from F to G, and from G to I. There's nowhere else to go from I, so I back up to G, and there's another neighbor, H. But there's nowhere else to go from H because E has already been marked. And like I said, I assume you're looking at your graph in your notes because I can't have it sitting up here. We back up to F. There is another neighbor to explore from F, which is D. And then from D, I can go to A. And from A, I can go to B. And there's no more unmarked neighbors from B. I back up A, go to C. And that would finish things off. And we notice here, when I started at E, and I started traversing, E had 3 neighbors, F, H, and D, in our original graph. And when I start looking at F, I eventually reach H and D. I can reach all the other neighbors of E. And what that tells me then is, I don't need to go through E to get to them. Yes, technically there would be these edges here that would connect things. I could have said that, okay, E was connected to H as well, and E was connected to D as well. And while I'm at it, I'll go ahead and draw in the other edges as well. So these are the edges we skipped over that we didn't bother using. The edges in black, the 4 of them, are the ones we didn't bother using in our spanning tree. And I'm not sure if the colors come through. So let me darken these in really thick. These thick edges are not part of our spanning tree. They're just the edges we skipped over. We're going to want them later on. So. And we say, okay, E had these other neighbors, H and D, And then, D could have gone to B and C as well, instead of just A. But what we have is the fact that E didn't need to look at H or D, because when it looked at F, F eventually reached H and D. And what that means for us is that there is a way of going from F to H without going through E. There is a way of going from F to D without going through E. And that means as far as connecting anything together, E can be removed safely. Because E says you can go from E to F, but then from F you could reach everything else. Where here you can go from D to A, and then from A you couldn't reach everything else. And that meant, and if I had started at B, I would have had a similar situation. Same with C, because none of those could have reached these vertices. And if I had started with the other neighbors of D, F or E, as my first neighbor of D, well, then I would have done all this traversal, but I couldn't have reached A, B, or C, and A, B, and C would have been in the second subtree of D. So these were the 5 neighbors of D, A, B, C, E, and F. No matter which one I chose as the first neighbor to explore, I'm going to end up with 2 subtrees of D, where here I had only 1 subtree of E. And so as a result, what this tells us is, in this graph, there's no way of reaching these vertices from these, or vice versa, unless we go through D. We have to go through D here. We have the ability to go from here to D and from D to all of those, but that's the only way to get from A, B, and C to E, F, G, H, and I. If there was a different way that didn't involve D, we would have found it when I traversed through here, because it must necessarily involve some edge from B to one of these 5, or from C to one of those 5, or A to one of those 5. Our infamous A to G path that we were worried about before. Well, if I have some path from A to G that doesn't involve D, it's going to involve some other of these vertices. Eventually, I'm going to need to say, well, from A, I'll go to some neighbor of it, some neighbor of it, and eventually I'll get to G. At some point, either A is going to have an edge to one of these directly, or B or C will have an edge to one of these, and I can go from A to B or C. But I don't. So if I can't reach A from a traversal of all of A's neighbors, if I can't reach G or any of these others from A, then that means there is no second way of reaching it. Because this is an undirected graph, I would have found that way with my traversal. And that's what happened here. From F, everything could be reached. So as I traversed, I found everything. And so even though I had these 2 extra neighbors of E, it didn't matter. They were all reachable from my first neighbor. And so I know here, ignoring the thick black lines for the moment, when you've got that spanning tree, if you remove E, you've got another spanning tree. All those vertices are connected through that tree. This is your outline of paths. If I want to go from I to C, I go I, G, F, D, A, C. No problem. None of these connections involve E. Where here, there's no way to go from this half of the tree to that half of the tree except by going through the root. And if you say, well, maybe there was some path we didn't draw in our spanning trees, the black lines, we say, well, there isn't, because if there was, we would have found it when we traversed the first subtree. Because we can draw those lines here as well. We can say, okay, I do have the 4 edges I skipped, the 4 edges of the graph that were not included in the spanning tree, and there's 2 of them right there, and here's a third, the H, and then here's the 4th from F to D. So if we're going to draw the 4 edges in, those are the 4 edges that didn't count in that tree. But we're saying if there was some edge that connected that half of the spanning tree to that half, then we would have found it when we were creating this spanning tree. Same thing as we did here. There was indeed an edge connecting F to D. We found it. So we didn't have to have D, A, B, C as a separate subtree. So this tells us if you were to do a depth first search on a vertex, such as D, if you end up with more than 1 child of the root, then that root must be an articulation point. It has to be a cut vertex. It means that the first child, the vertices of the first child subtree could not reach the vertices in your second or third or fourth, if you have one, the second or third or fourth subtrees. and therefore they can't reach it except by going through the root. The root must be an articulation point. Where if it's not an articulation point, and E is not, then you have only one child. It means when I look at that one child, I'll be able to reach everything from that one child without having to return to the root and explore a different neighbor off the root. I could reach them through the root too, and we saw that with the darkened and skipped edges. But I do have the chance to have reached everything from that first choice of neighbor without backing up to the root. And that means that then the root could perhaps be eliminated and I can still reach everything. We've pretty much outlined the spanning tree on the remainder of the vertices. Well, where here we can't create a spanning tree with just the remainder of the vertices. There's no way to create a spanning tree without using D. Because if we could create a spanning tree, we would have created it as we tried to create one using depth first search off of A. So that suggests then that a naive algorithm for finding articulation points in an undirected graph. To find cut vertices in an undirected graph. I think the book's proof, I think, that it all works uses the term cut vertices extensively. I tend to use articulation points. That's how I first learned it. So I'm trying to switch between the terminology. So to do that, run V depth first search. Depth first search traversals. Each time starting at a different vertex. So you run depth first search on each of V vertices, and then you look at the resultant spanning trees, and the depth first spanning trees where the root has 2 or more children. The root is a cut vertex. And that's really all there is to it. Now, this is not going to be the best way to do this, but we'll talk about that next time. We're not done yet. But the idea here then is, having seen this example we saw where if you did a traversal on E, you had one child. If you did a traversal on D, you had 2. If you tried a traversal on all the other members of the graph, you'd have a similar result. If you did a depth first search starting at A, you'd have only one child of the root. If you did a depth first search starting at B, you'd have only one child of the root. If you did a depth first search at G, you would have 2 children. Because I, if we put back the original graph for a moment, even though you should have it in your notes, if we put back the original graph, from G, we'll be able to look at I first, and then we say, but we can't reach anything else at all from I. We'll have to back up to G and then search the rest of the graph. And so if we were to start at G, we would end up with I as a neighbor and then everything else as the other neighbor. So again, we'll definitely have 2 children there. And if you say, well, don't start at I, well, then that's fine. Start at F or start at H, the other 2 neighbors of G. We'll be able to reach, if we start at H, everything else, but we won't be able to reach I. We'll have to return to G and search a second neighbor to get to I. So we will end up with 2 children on G as well. And so that's one way to deal with finding articulation points. We say run V depth first search traversals. Each time you start on one of the other vertices of the graph. That's why you do V of them, because there's V vertices. And then whenever you end up with a spanning tree where the root has more than one child, well, then that root is an articulation point. And so if you have V different traversals and the root is different each time, then that will tell you information about every vertex in the graph. Problem is, so we know from our graph then we know that if you go ahead yourself and do a depth first search on every vertex, start at A and then do it again but start at B, then do it again but start at C, what you'll find is you'll see what I said is true. And that might be an interesting exercise for depth first search practice. Go ahead and run depth first search starting at every different vertex of that graph. And you'll see that D and G are the only ones that end up with 2 children. And so remember that depth first search is order V plus E. And so this cut vertex detection algorithm is going to be order V times V plus E, which is basically the equivalent of V squared plus VE. And so it turns out then that this algorithm is going to be no better than V squared. If we have no edges, we have V squared plus V. If we have, or V squared plus 0, I guess. If we have a dense graph, then E would be V squared. And if that happens to be the case, we'd have V squared plus V times V squared, which is basically order V cubed. I mean, not do it that way. This is for dense graphs. So it could be as bad as order V cubed. But if we have a sparse graph, it'll still be V squared. We can't do any better than V squared here. And so we'd like an algorithm that might run better than V squared time. And that's where we want to pick up next time. What we're going to do is say, instead of doing V separate depth first searches, what we're going to do is to say, let's see if we can draw any more information from the one we've already done. If we do a depth first search, fine. We already know how to get information about the root of that spanning tree. And then we can tell, is the root an articulation point or not. But let's use that same traversal and try and find information about the other vertices as well. And that's what we'll do next time. So this was your introduction to the brute force approach. And then next time we'll try and speed things up by saying, let's do just one depth first search, and then try and draw information from that one search instead of doing the searches over and over and over again, which will end up being very expensive. So that's it for now. And like I said, this was a shorter lecture, and the next one will be shorter as well. And the two of them combined to be about like an hour and a half or that kind of thing. So that's it for now, and I will see you next time. Take care.